Hello and welcome to this afternoon's industry session. Thank you so much for making it. We're delighted to have so many of you. My name's Julia Andrews-Clifford and I am the manager of the Young Film Programmers Network Southeast. And it is my massive pleasure to welcome Jo Duncombe from the British Film Council to talk today about the female gaze and women in film. We have half an hour of me getting to pose the questions and then half an hour of you lot. You can put a question in the Q&A as soon as you come up with it. And at 5 o'clock, I will start firing those at Jo. So please start filling it up straight away. Don't put it in the chat, put it in the Q&A. And also, if you'd like to access the live captioning, go to the bottom of your screen and you can find them there. So today's session is about young film programmers and others getting a chance to fire questions to those people who are working directly in the industry and to learn about different types of programming. And so today we're focusing on women in film. It is really exciting that we've got Jo here, who is live from France and maternity leave. So both of those is the power of Zoom that we can actually get to speak to you. And also just to say thank you so much for joining us today. It is a great pleasure and honour to have you.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm sort of very slowly coming back to work after maternity leave, and I can't think of a lovelier way to come back to the world of work than to talk about the female gaze in cinema and programming. So thank you so much for having me, and hello to everyone. I can't see you, but I'm imagining lots of people behind screens and how much the world has changed since I went on maternity leave. Absolutely. That this is the norm for everyone now.
Yeah, so, and it's brilliant. And we were talking before, and one of Jo's work has been with the Bird's Eye Film Festival, who actually subverted the Q&A. So we talked a little bit about this before, and just before we start, obviously that sense of the expert in the chair, on the panel, on the stage, to be questioned and have all the answers. Bird's Eye Film Festival and Jo have kind of disrupted that. And so we're just going to kickstart before we do any more, is that Jo is just going to pose a question to you to start thinking about, rather than already always about her answering the questions. So I'm just going to hand over quickly for that, Jo.
Thanks, Julia. Yeah, so the idea, like Julia said, is really through a lot of the programming and the conception that we had when I was working with Bird's Eye View on their Reclaim the Frame programme, is all about thinking about where the audience sits and what the audience wants and how to serve the audience best. So the idea is that I pose you a question at the beginning of this talk, and maybe you can ruminate on it while we're chatting, and then instead of necessarily posing me a question at the end, perhaps some responses to that provocation would be great, as a great way to start the discussion at the end. So my provocation is, what comes first, the film or the audience?
Fantastic. So with that in mind, let's start. So I'd like to introduce Jo. For those who don't know about Jo's work, Jo is a freelance film curator now. However, she has worked in many curatorial roles across her career so far. At present, she is the programme manager at the British Film Council.
British Council Film, which is a bit different to British Film Council, sorry.
Sorry, thank you. Say that again.
Right. So it's British Council Film. The BFI used to be the British Film Council, so it's a bit confusing and everyone always gets it mixed up. So sorry.
Thank you so much, as did I. So
me too.
That's her current role. But she has previously been creative producer at the Bird's Eye Film Festival and helped launch their Reclaim the Frame programme. She's also worked with the Independent Cinema Office as a curator, the London Short Film Festival, who we had Philip Ilson last month, and also the Victoria Film Festival in Canada. So she has worked in curation and film programming and is passionate about championing underrepresented voices. And so it's really exciting to have you here today, because a lot of the young programmers and the groups are really about making a difference. And so we're hoping that we can ask questions and pose questions to you about how to do that in the realms of reclaiming the frame for women directors, editors, and writers. So first of all, first question, which we ask everyone, but it's really interesting, is how did you get into curating, and did you do a university degree in film or curation? And then also just a little flavour of that journey from when you left school to where you are now, and any kind of defining moments.
Sure. So I didn't actually study film, but I was always really passionate about cinema. I was lucky to have parents that liked to take me to the cinema when I was little. And then at university, I studied... it feels a long time ago now. I studied English literature actually in theatre, but through that course I realised that it was film that I was really interested in, and also contemporary culture and contemporary culture practice and the way that we consume culture. So that through my undergraduate degree, I did quite a lot of work around sort of film adaptation. And so I did lots of modules that kind of took me off in that direction. And then I did a master's at Birkbeck, which I did part-time while I was working through their kind of night program. So that the way they run that university is that you can study at night time, so you can fit it around work, and you can do part-time MAs, which is what I did. And through that, I did a master's on contemporary culture, which looked a lot at kind of cultural spaces and how audiences kind of respond and engage with cultural space. So there was a bit of work on like architectural theory and stuff that took me on all kinds of different directions. And then I also looked through that MA to do some courses in film. And it was from there that I learned about the kind of film festival scene in the UK. And I started, like, some of the teachers on that course introduced us to film festivals. And, you know, it's something I knew absolutely nothing about, really, the film festival scene when I was at, obviously I knew about film, but I didn't know about how really they were exhibited. And so through that, I heard about Bird's Eye View Film Festival, which was this film festival that at the time it was a festival that happened once a year at the BFI. And I just got in touch with them, and I was like, I think what you're doing is amazing. I'd love to learn more. Can I come and meet you? And it happened to be an email that I sent in a sort of down point in the year for the festival, when they weren't busy, and they were actually doing a paid internship, or they were advertising for a paid internship. So they said, why don't you apply? Which I did. And it was through that I then got to work on the first film festival with them that I did, was the Celebrating Arab Women Film Festival that they did. I think it was in 2013 or 2014. And through that, I kind of got involved in the world, and I went to the BFI for the first time, and I had an amazing time, and that's how I kind of got into the scene. And I definitely drunk the Kool-Aid. Got very excited.
I mean, that's brilliant and really exciting that it was through a paid internship, and also just kind of having a go and getting in there and saying, I'm really interested. It does happen. You do get, if you were lucky on the timing.
Yeah, there was, as with a lot of things, I think there was some luck involved. Let's be honest, but it was a really wonderful thing to discover, and I found that I had been working or trying to look at work in the theatre industry at the time, because I wasn't sure at that time what I wanted to do, and I was pushing at lots of doors and not getting anywhere, and found that the festival world was actually a really welcoming world, and there were lots of really interesting and unusual people there who wanted to talk and wanted to share their experiences, and that was my way in.
Yeah, brilliant. And so then how did that lead to the job at the British Council?
So from Bird's Eye View, when the festival happened, the person curating the festival, the Arab Women Filmmakers Festivals, is a wonderful person called Elham Shakarafar, and she is a documentary producer, creative producer, brilliant mind, and she also does lots of curating and programming as well, and writing. And she, through that, I started, this is often what happens if you work on a kind of a festival where there's lots of freelancers who come in, build a team, and then go off again at another point in the year. So you end up kind of making these connections with individuals, and then maybe working on one of their projects, and then they introduce you to someone else, and etc., etc. And so Elham, I started working with Elham on some of her documentary releases, because she happened to have a desk space in the same studio that Bird's Eye View was based in. So I kind of met her team, and we started working on I helped her on the release of her documentary film, A Syrian Love Story, which was amazing. And then I met, going to festivals and working on festivals, you meet other festivals. And then I met the team from London Short Film Festival, and I met Philip Ilson, and I told him that I was leaving this festival because it was finished and I was looking for more work. And through that, I met Philip Ilson, who's the artistic director of London Short Film Festival. And then eventually I started working with them as a producer, and really cut my teeth on the sort of short film world, and understood what happened in the short film world, and new talent, and got to know lots of early career filmmakers through my work with London Short Film Festival. And that role there at that point is probably the role that most helped me get the job that I now have at British Council, in that at British Council I look after new talent and short film. But in between London Short Film Festival and British Council, I worked at the ICO as a programmer, working with lots of independent cinemas around the country, helping them to choose the films that they would put into their regular programming. And I also then, and after that, I went to Bird's Eye View, back to Bird's Eye View in a new iteration of the organisation as a kind of a year-round campaigning group, advocating for more films written, directed by women and non-binary people in cinemas. And with that, I kind of helped to set up the Reclaim the Frame programme with Mia Bays, who's the kind of the big boss at Bird's Eye View, and that was an amazing experience. And then I got the job at British Council, and I thought I could do part-time there and some part-time freelance programming as well, which is what I do now.
Fantastic. And I mean, so many different varied workplaces. You obviously gathered lots of contacts, which all crossed intersections. So you actually end up knowing lots of people. So the more jobs in a way you do, the better. But
yeah, it's stressful, isn't it? I think, but I think that's the nature of contemporary work, is that you kind of have to balance lots of different things. There's often freelance gigs, and particularly festivals that, there's people on the festival circuit that do different jobs for different festivals at different points in the year to help build a profile of work that makes up a whole, year-round job. But, there's, I think we were talking about this earlier, Julia, that freelance work is as much the work of finding the work as it is doing the work. So, it's a kind of, mix of lots of
it's good
projects.
You had a mix with some organisations as well as not being freelance the whole time, so that kind of balances out some of that workload. Absolutely. Can we talk a little bit, because a lot of the people listening might not know about Reclaim the Frame and Bird's Eye. Just to say a little bit, I'll quote from Mia Bays: "The upswell of energy, anger and passion for change following the revelations of widespread sexual harassment and misconduct in Hollywood and beyond has strengthened Bird's Eye's resolve to tackle gender inequality and the power imbalance in film. The time for change is now, and we see this unique programme as fitting squarely into this aspiration. We define films by women as directed or written, screenplay, sourcebook or autobiography, by a woman." So could you tell us a little bit about your work on Reclaim the Frame and the approach that you took in terms of your working practices to make gender equality happen in film?
Sure. So the interesting thing with Bird's Eye View is, like you might have picked up, that it used to be a film festival, and it happened once a year at BFI, and it would take place over about sort of 4 or 5 days, and that was it. But it had an amazing following of audiences who, when the funding stopped for the festival, were just still there and wanted to continue seeing films directed by women. And obviously there are loads of great organisations doing loads of work, but it felt like a real shame to let that network of audiences and filmmakers go. But what we talked about, Mia and I, and was really that the idea of a festival being this kind of one-off celebratory event once a year is great, but what we wanted to do was bring in an approach to curating and programming that would normalise seeing and supporting films by women in the cinema year round, without for it to be a kind of gradual building and shifting of audience culture, where we could create a reality that would mean that audiences would have access to and want to and regularly see films directed by women or written by women. And what we also wanted to do was give audiences the power, or to feel empowered, that their action in buying a ticket and putting their bum on a seat in the cinema would actually make a difference, in that by choosing to see these films that we could recommend and suggest, they could, as audience members, change the way that the cinemas and the curators and the programmers in the cinemas think about films directed by women, because they would realise that audiences do want to see them and will come. So one of the first functions we did was we thought about building networks in the local communities around the UK that we worked with, and to go and listen to what they wanted and to how the community culture of cinema going works, because each cinema has its own ecosystem and every community that each cinema serves works differently. And what we didn't want to do is go in as two kind of London-based women and tell people what they should watch and how they should watch it, because it doesn't work, because every ecosystem is very different. So we went to each town and or community cinema, and we spoke to audiences, and we presented them with this idea that, you know, we want to give you help us build a network of people who want to support films directed by women, and we'll give you free tickets. So that was the idea, that everyone who signed up would get they would pay for a ticket, and they would then also get a free ticket to give to someone else to help grow that network of people that would come regularly to the cinema. And that's how we worked it. And the idea was also that we would always bring a conversation to the cinema. So it wouldn't just be, here's a great film that we think you should watch, bye. It would be, here's a film that we think is interesting, and you might have a different opinion about it. You might think it's rubbish, or you might think it's problematic, or you might think that, you know, whatever. But let's have a discussion about that, and let's be nuanced about it. Let's build a space where the grey area of discussion can flourish, because having, you know, we didn't want things to be very black and white in terms of the way we were presenting films. We wanted it to be like I say, very nuanced, and so we'd often try and, you know, make sure that we would bring talent from the film to come with us to the cinema, and also to set up workshops and kind of thematic things that were in the film. So, for example, the film Pincushion by Deborah Haywood, we would do a pincushion making workshop after the film or before the film. The idea being that if you give people something to do with their hands, something to do collectively around the film that's creative, it will open up a space for discussion that's less hierarchical and less audience filmmaker, and more communal. And that idea seemed to really work, and it meant that people came not just for a film but for a really good chat and to learn something new, and that way we helped to kind of grow audiences for the films that we were presenting. So that was the kind of basic idea for how Reclaim the Frame would work, and it, you know, it's amazing to see how it's growing and developing in the time since I've left Bird's Eye View officially, like that it's become a really amazing advocacy campaign that's really, I think, making a big difference.
Yeah, and I mean, when I did the research for today, it was that those A and Q events got big numbers, sellouts, and a lot of buzz and word of mouth happened around those. So a lot of the people watching, young programmers, there's a sense that sometimes it's the event around it and the way you approach it more than the film sometimes.
Yeah, and so, often the idea was often that we might present films that, you know, we didn't. There was one film, for example, called Revenge by Coralie Fagier, who's a French director, and the film is a rape revenge, very garish, very kind of in your face piece of cinema that, you know, for some people was too much, too difficult, too you know, on the face value, a bit problematic even. But what we wanted to do was be able to create space to spotlight films that might fit within those categories of being difficult, or because women should be able to make those films as much as men, you know, and for there to be space for those films to have conversation and debate, and for it not to be the end of the world if people don't like the film, you know. There has to be space for that too.
Absolutely. And I mean, you used the word normalizing, and so rather than it, you know, I guess also it might be a thing, your recommendations, I would say some of them, that obviously is a very like women's issue film you're talking about there, but in your recommendations for the watch parties later, it's really great that the Hallis film, it's just a film made by a woman, and you probably wouldn't even know that. And so having that kind of just a kind of normal balance to things, rather than always being a celebration of women's issues or a woman director, I think that's quite radical, and a shift maybe from how lots of people around International Women's Day, International Women's Month, is obviously a great focus for activism, but in terms of sustainable year-round working practices for young programmers, that's, you know, I'd like to push you a little bit and ask you, you know, again, for people who are watching, most of you will probably know, but in case not, the F certificate, some cinemas have been using that as a way of flagging up a film made by a woman. I think might be starring a woman as well. Someone maybe can correct me on that. And also, of course, the Bechdel test, which is the rule that if there are two female characters who are talking to one another and named, I think, and they're not talking about a man, then that passes the Bechdel test. So tell us a little bit about those two things, and in relation to, you know, what tips and pitfalls young programmers might face when thinking about how they raise the platform for women in film and women's films.
I think you know, F-rated and Bechdel tests are really great resources and really great tools. You know, they're slightly different from the way I've worked, but I think what they do is amazing, and a really incredible resource for cinemas to help, like you say, normalise what we see on screen being told from the female gaze. I think my view is that women should be able to make all kinds of films, any kind of film, whatever kind of film, whenever they want, however they want, you know. And you know, I think of a film like The Rider by Chloe Zhao, which is a kind of Western about masculinity. Central character is a male. There aren't many female characters. And I remember presenting that film with Bird's Eye View, and some of the people in the audience were upset that it wasn't about a woman. And my response to that was, why should she have to make a film about women? Like she wanted to tell a story, a tale about masculinity in a very specific environment in the Midwest in the US, and it's, for me, an incredible piece of filmmaking, incredibly well observed characters, and yeah, I guess but it's complex, and you know, other people may strongly disagree with me on that, and I think that we have to have a cinema culture where there's space for those disagreements and space for programmers to take different takes on what they think matters for audiences to see, you know, and audiences to have the space to say, actually, I don't want to see that, I want to see more of this, and for there to be that choice available, which is why programming is so important, and very diverse and varied programming is so important, because audiences want different things at different times.
Yeah, and I think we talked about earlier, it doesn't always have to be an either or. No. So some of the groups have done fantastic like takeover days called like the female gaze, or there was a season called Visionary Women, which used archive from the ICO. So it's not an either or. Obviously, there are celebratory festivals that you can set up, and sometimes for a young programmer group, it's a lot more manageable because they're not in charge of the whole program. So that is obviously an easier way. But then also, if you're moving into being part of the programming team, it's really great to hear how your everyday practices start to not discriminate between or actively look for more female directors without necessarily flagging it, I guess. I wanted to ask you about the female gaze as well, that, you know, again, it's a funny expression. Can you tell us a little bit about where the expression comes from and what your take on that is?
I think female is a very complex and loaded word, and it's basically means anyone who wants to identify as female, and that perspective has so often been underrepresented and underseen, and for me it's just about ensuring that those perspectives, that we have a varied and diverse and vibrant prism to look through when we're looking at the cinema, and that is for me means that it shouldn't just be, because if you look at the statistics, have I gone? It says my internet connection is unstable.
No, you're still here.
Okay, I'm still here. If you look at the statistics, it is like largely men telling stories to us, and the world isn't like that. And so, yeah, it's just about ensuring that we get a balanced view. Like, I'm not saying men should make films. I love loads of films by men. I just want to see more variation and more balance in representing who we are as humans. Yeah. And that means that, of course, that means that feminist perspectives in cinema have to intersect. You can't, it has to intersect with all the varied viewpoints and storytellers on the planet, and you can't just look at it through a single narrow prism, because the world isn't like that and humans aren't like that, and yeah, it would be dangerous to go down that route.
Yeah, I think. Brilliant. I've got so many more questions, but I've realized the time and it's 5 o'clock and the questions are coming in now, so I'll come back to some of mine if we run out of the questions, but I'm going to go first to following that really from Amy Cresswell, who says, and it's kind of on what we've been talking about, how can we change the idea of something made by a woman from being a woman's film to a film for everyone, especially when it stars or focuses on women? Would this have to be rooted in a deeper cultural change of editing the concept of women's issues?
Wow, it's a big question, but I think it's a really amazing question. And it's a question of like what our ideal is, where we want to get and where we are now. And I think where we are now is that we have to advocate and we have to campaign and we have to actively discriminate to make space, because we're pushing against a canon that doesn't want to give us space, right? And so we have to be active. You have to push back, because if you don't, you'll get consumed and your voice will get lost. And so, yeah, I think there has to be a deeper cultural change. And I think a lot of the work that Bird's Eye View are doing, for example, is about gradually shifting the parameters, right? It's about gradually moving out and building space through the audiences, giving audiences power to demonstrate what they want from the cinema. And that is about community building, which does take time. But the reality is, where we are is the statistics, you know, I think you said, Julia, the latest statistics show that, you know, there's about a 4% increase or something in the number of films being made and directed by women. That's good. It's not good enough. And so the campaigning has to continue, but the campaigning has to be, I think, it has to be communal and collective and caring. And there's, you know, and in the campaigning world, there are so many factions and so many people working on different projects and pushing for different things, that there can sometimes be a sense of rivalry between causes, you know. And I think that's where the intersectionality of feminism and representing diverse voices in cinema needs to, you know, a lot of work needs to be done in the feminist space to make sure that that everyone's working together, or at least working for equality, working for balance and fairness. And that means kind of, again, that's a cultural shift. You're right, Amy, I think, and it takes time. But I'm hopeful that there is fire under the movements, and I'm hopeful that people see the importance of, even if they're working on different causes, that underneath it is a communal care for equality and fair representation. So yeah, I think it's a mix of those two things, and it's about always keeping in mind what we want, what the ideal is, because we have to be idealistic, we have to work towards it, even though the reality means hard graft.
Yeah, and I think it's really great, the kind of positivity, because we were talking about that statistic and we put it out on our Facebook, you know, that there's 15% of the top 100 or so top selling films this last year were, no, 2019. So you've got to get your facts right, was 15%. But there was another statistics from Little White Lies that we posted up as well, which was in 2018, it was 4%. Then in 2019, it jumped to 12%. And then last year, it was 16%. So you could say, oh my goodness, 15 or 16% is a terrible statistic, because look at that, it's not even a quarter. And obviously that long history of silent women in the industry, or the editors that were silent behind the scenes, and you know how there's a whole kind of film history about women in film, but that's quite a rapid rise. And if you can keep that positivity, that maybe not get too bogged down in the negative of those statistics, and actually there is change happening, but knowing it's slow. But there is, with the Me Too movement and things, there does seem to have been a shift. I mean, maybe I'm naive and over hopeful, but there does seem to have been a shift.
And we're, you know, the work that we're all doing, we're humans, right? And you can't, sometimes you have to choose to feel positive. You have to make that choice, because the statistics are overwhelmingly negative, right? I mean, 16% or 4%, they're both a bit shit. But actually, if you allow yourself to get overwhelmed by how bad it is, it can put you off wanting to do the work, right? So I think I try in my working practice to not check the statistics too often, because actually I want to find that positivity from within myself and within the communities that we work with, and that's where it comes from. And yeah, I think you're right, you've got to try and stay positive.
Yeah, and so on that note, you know, your work at the British Council, which is a very institutional organisation at the heart of power. So can you tell us a little bit about what you actually, your daily week would look like working with them?
Yeah, so my role at BC is I'm a film programme manager, so there's a film team, and all the different arts sectors have got teams, And our jobs are really kind of promoting British filmmakers on an international circuit, and that means, it means like presenting work internationally at festivals and helping filmmakers get their work seen internationally. But the idea with that is also that it's about building international connections so that filmmakers here get the opportunity to work internationally, and that means opening their eyes to new ideas, new ways of working, new opportunities through the international professional scene. And so it's about kind of, and my work particularly is with new talent and short filmmakers, so that loops back round to the work that I did with Philip on the London Short Film Festival. But working in a big institution has its challenges, and it has power structures that make it very difficult sometimes to do exactly what you want to do. And institutional work has those issues, and you have to balance them and navigate through them, and it's hard sometimes, it really is. But I try to keep with me all the time the idea that I want to work and support filmmakers at the start of their careers, and particularly enable filmmakers who are from underrepresented backgrounds in the industry to feel that the industry is there for them and supportive, and not this kind of difficult space to navigate, and that there's support available, basically.
Yeah, well, on that note, so we've got a couple of makers. Great. Who so we've got, from Tilia, as a young female filmmaker getting started making short films, how would I start getting my films out there for film programmers to notice?
That's a great question. Hi, Tilia. I think the festival space is a really interesting space, and there's great film festivals like Underwire who champion shorts by women directors. There's lots of great programmers who work across different festivals, and I think I think festivals are an interesting choice for filmmakers, short filmmakers. They're not always the right choice. There's always the opportunity to put your work online and find ways of showing your work online. But festivals are a really great way of kind of building international status and profile for your work. And also, other programmers visit other festivals. So it's a way of kind of growing your exposure to festival programmers. Reaching programmers, it's about kind of submitting your films to festivals, going to festivals, because festival programmers are at festivals. I mean, I know the landscape is not so much a space at the moment where you can go to festivals, but coming to events like this and asking questions of programmers, understanding what different festivals want. Like each cinema has its own ecosystem and its own specific interests and ways of presenting work, as do film festivals. And I think you can have a look at other filmmakers that you like, whose work you admire, and look at what kind of festival journey they've had, and see whether you can mimic it in some way. I think there's no easy way of answering that question, because festival programmers have access to a lot of work through submissions, and that's largely how they watch work. But I think being present at industry things like this and speaking to programmers if you get the opportunity, so they know you, like they're human and like people. So I'm sure there's ways to kind of build relationships that way. I hope that helps, Tilia. I'm sorry if it doesn't.
No, that's great. I mean, we can send out Underwire, and maybe we'll look at some other festivals that might be particularly focused on young short film female.
Yeah, Underwire is a great start. Definitely.
Yeah, great. And on a similar note, but on the programming side of the coin, from Beth, many festival freelance roles are varied, but junior roles around programming are rare. Do you have any tips for gaining programming experience?
I think you're very that's a very astute observation, Beth. It's true that it is very difficult to find entry-level programming work. I started with Bird's Eye View on in marketing, but that was actually a really great way to understand more about how to communicate cinema to audiences and how to communicate curated programs to audiences. I had to get to know every film very well that was in the festival, and I had to put together ways of telling audiences about what the films were and why they might be interested in seeing them. And that for me was a really great way to understand what you need to have as a programmer or a curator. You have to know the films inside out, and you have to really always be thinking about the audiences and what they want. So that was for me a really great way into it. I would also say that, like, festivals, a lot of people I know got into programming through attending festivals, either as audiences or as volunteering on certain evenings to so you get to see the films and hand out the what are they called?
Yeah, the audience surveys.
Or surveys at the end, right? But it means you get to go and see all the films, and you get to be part of a festival team, and you get to meet people in the festival, and you get to kind of work out who likes what and who's doing what, and kind of, you know, basically meet people that might help you get your foot in. And so, yeah, I think early programming experiences in official roles are really difficult to find, you're right. But there's also a big argument for just going out there and doing it. Like, if you've got a program in mind that you love and you think about, and you're like, I'd love one day to do that, why don't you write it down on a piece of paper, put it down, get some thoughts down on paper, and then approach people, approach venues, say, look, I've got this idea, I've made this collective with these other curators, and we want to put this on, this is what we focus on, are you interested? Lots of people do that, and lots of venues love that, because it's a really great way of getting films and interesting stuff into their venues. So, you know, there's a lot to be said for just doing it as well.
Absolutely. I mean, our last session with Philip Ilson was really inspiring in that way, that just do it. But also wanted to ask, so you personally, have you found any barriers into, you know, has you got into the industry, do you think, because you're a woman?
I think I was lucky in that my way into the industry was through an organisation like Bird's Eye View, where no one was going to tell me I wasn't allowed to do it because I was a woman, because that would have been really anti the organisation. But I would say that something I do notice again and again and again in myself and in the industry is the kind of discrepancy between salaries. I know that a lot of men doing similar jobs probably get paid a lot more than me, and I think that's something that is very insidious and very problematic. And it's not just men getting paid more; it's white people get paid more. There's lots of issues that I see and I've experienced and I know about and are problematic. And it takes a lot, particularly when you're at the beginning of your career, but actually I think all the way throughout your career, to call people up on that stuff and to expose it. And I think, I think people should, ideally, we should be thinking about creating a working culture in the arts where people are more transparent and more honest about things like that. Yeah.
Well, great. And I mean, I think that's fascinating that, it's moved on to a salaries question, but also we were talking, weren't we, earlier, that, both of us as white middle-class women who were able to go to university, there is less barrier there for us. Whereas, if you're from a lower income, if you're from an ethnic minority, it's much more challenging. But also the climate is changing where, as you say, cinemas are really looking to be wider with their audiences and their staffing. And so there is an opportunity, to actually be proactive and present yourself as a string to their bow, as it were, so that they can be more diverse.
Yeah, and but I also think there's a lot to be said for kind of decentering institutions entirely. I've seen a question that I really like in the chat. Do you mind if I?
Yes,
So
go. Yes.
Eugenie's asked about the canon, right, and how the canon works in programming, and whether we should reclaim the canon by just putting women filmmakers into the existing canon, or find a whole new canon entirely. And I think the same question can also, I'll come back to that question, but I think the same question can also apply to the way that we visualize the institutions that populate our industry. You know, this idea of going it on your own and doing it by yourself a little bit sometimes. I think the more we can find ways to support early career people to do that, and not have to rely on the institutions to tell us how and why we should do things and the way to do things, the better, right? I think that there should be more space for freelance programmers and more support for freelance programmers, and to work in ways that kind of bulldoze through the institutional space a little bit. And I think that's a really healthy thing that needs to happen for the industry and for viewing culture. And on the question of, you know, inserting women filmmakers into existing canons, or finding a new Karen, Freudian Karen slip, finding a new canon. I think there's a bit of both. I think, you know, I think there, as the canons were made, there were a lot of women that got ignored, who were doing equally brilliant work at the same time as people who were recognised. And I think that there's a job to be done in recognising those that were ignored at the time. And I think there's a lot around archive and the way archive is even created, right? That a lot of voices within archive weren't even deemed necessary to archive. So even when we dig in the archives to find who was missed out, we'll find that maybe the archives weren't even created for people. So it's about finding also in the present ways to make sure that contemporary filmmakers are getting the recognition and the space that they deserve, to ensure that the archives that we build for future generations are much more balanced and realistic about the world that we live in.
Yeah, and I think, you know, that the sort of realistic, but also, you know, that confidence you're talking about, and we talked about earlier. And I think, you know, that young programmers here that can do something and make a change, and also they might have different point of view. So if you're talking about the canon, or breaking the canon, or coming up with your you know, a disruption to that, you might come across different opinions, but it's kind of keeping some confidence in your female gaze, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And I think venues and institutions, you know, they need to listen and recognize that that provocations and interventions and disruptions of what is normal practice, especially now after and during COVID, like there we are at a point, I think, as an industry, and where there's space to change, because things have changed so much, and I see the cinema space as a really ripe civic space, where interventions can and should be made, and rather than being risk averse, we should be looking at industry leaders to actually step aside and give space for new things, new voices, new perspectives, more so than ever, I think.
So on that, I'm going to go to Malaika, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, from Rain Dance, who's a programmer at Rain Dance, and they look especially for female work and promote it as much as possible. What more can we do to help campaigning? She asks.
That's a really good question as well. It's quite, I'm just going to have a think before I answer, because I don't want to rush into an answer.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose I read it as something, you know, in terms of funding and things like that. But I'm not sure if she does. Maybe it's a shame.
I suppose it comes back to like positioning films by women or films from diverse and underrepresented voices. I think, campaigning needs to be about making audiences, connecting with audiences emotionally, and where they might not have previously felt confident or interested, demonstrating ways that why these films should be seen and should be encouraged and should be seen more widely. And I think that's about building networks and reaching out sideways across the community and the audience spaces to make sure that you reach as many people as possible across campaigning groups. And that comes back to what I was saying about, not working in silos when we're thinking about advocacy. We have to work communally and responsibly with as many networks as we can, because the underlying cause is the same, that we want diversity in our cinema spaces.
Yeah. So I think any last questions, get them in now, because we've only got 5 minutes. I've got a last question from Elizabeth from Peru.
Wow. Hi.
Lima in Peru, and they're working on a film programming about music and sound, including international films. What do you think about mixing film and music universes in a curation with a feminist and LGBT perspective? What recommendations do you have? And thank you for this talking.
A pleasure. It sounds great. It sounds really interesting. I'd love to know more about it. And I think, of course, like that does come back to what I was saying about not working in silos. That you want to do a program about music and sound, and of course that's going to intersect across lots of different campaigning and interest groups. Of course it is, and the more that you can bring people into that space and connect audiences, the better. And it's a really great way of building audiences for your project, because you're speaking to lots of different groups, and there'll be something in it for all of them, and they'll probably also find out about things that they didn't know about in different areas, and that will be great. It sounds wonderful. You have to find a way of telling us more about it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So in the last 5 minutes, let's return to our subverted Q&A to look out to you lot watching as the experts and answer the question. Maybe if you could reiterate it, Jo, to remind everyone, just for a little brief discussion. I'm not sure how we do that without all the unmuting happening.
Maybe people can jump in the chat, and I don't know, maybe it's not for now anyway, that maybe people want to go away and think about it, but the provocation was, what comes first, the audience or the film? So when you're thinking about the programs that you put together or you want to put together, is it the film that drives you, that you want to share with the audience, or is it that you want to connect with a particular audience and then you find the film that works for the audience? I think that's something that I don't think there is a right answer, but it's something that I always think about when I think about what I want to present or how I want to present it. And to be honest, I've worked in both ways and found both to be very rewarding. But if anyone has any thoughts or ruminations on that, it would be great.
It would be great to put them in the chat there, because obviously as young programmers and others working in the field, there is, that knowledge seeking, and we might finish a little bit on some of your recommendations for, whatever we think of the canon, we'll still have to look at films and find out more about them in history and contemporary. So I wanted to, ask, what was the first film that got you into the subject of women in film? And do you have any personal recommendations, not canonical ones, but personal recommendations that people might follow up with by checking out after this session?
I don't know the first film I saw that was directed by women, and I think that's probably a good thing. I don't know. and I think that's where we want to get, right? We want to be watching films and not necessarily thinking about who made them. We want to feel that whenever we go to the cinema, we're seeing something that might speak to us in a meaningful way. But I think, you know, the first Bird's Eye View Film Festival that I worked on, the Celebrating Arab Women Filmmakers, was a really great insight into another film culture that I hadn't experienced before. And what was one of the films that I can talk about there? Vajda, the Haifa al-Mansour Saudi Arabian film, was first film directed by a woman in Saudi Arabia about a young girl who gets a bicycle. Was the first film that I was very conscious of watching something from a perspective that I hadn't seen before, and that was really exciting to me. And I think I'm also going to spotlight one of the programs actually that I did for London Short Film Festival a few years ago was a film by the Iranian filmmaker Farouk Farrokhzad, who was making films in the 1960s, and she only made one film. She was also a poet, and she made a really beautiful film about a leper colony in northwestern Iran called The House is Black. And I think you can see it somewhere on YouTube with English subtitles, and it's a really beautiful piece of cinema, a short film. So
wonderful. Yeah, we'll try and get those. I think they're in the chat now actually as well. That is, you know, it's great. Even just sometimes you follow a lead, don't you? It's not a canon, but it's really great. Sometimes you hop from one recommendation or one, you know, director to another. And I just wanted to flag, obviously, to all the young programmers out there, if you haven't seen the Women Make Film documentary by Mark Cousins that's on BFI Player, it's about 8 hours, and it's a real eye-opener for those filmmakers that you hadn't necessarily heard of before. So it goes beyond the VADAs of this world, even though we're not knocking VADA.
But yeah, we can't.
And there's I'm checking the chat because we've got really nice, it's disappeared from me to see, but it said they thought it was a balance. It's back to your question. Someone, Betel, has said, I think in terms of audience or film, it's a marrying of the two. If there is a film that really strikes me as needing to be shown, then I would let that guide me. However, most often I find I curate films keeping in mind an audience I'd like to reach. So that's good for the starting point. We've got to finish there. I'm so sorry. There's so much more to talk about, but thank you all so much for coming, and thank you so much, Jo, for giving us your time and thoughts about it. It's like, it feels like it's the beginning of the discussion, not the end.
Very much so, which is how it should be.
Yeah. So thanks so much. And we will hope that you will go and follow up on some of those recommendations that were on the newsletter. Body Beautiful on BFI Player Archives, Charlie's Black Magic on BFI Player Archives, and Rocks on Netflix. Yeah. So those were 3 to get you started. And if you want, I'll probably send out on the network email some of the other recommendations and tips and references that Jo has mentioned. But that's it for now. Thank you all everyone. So much.
Thanks for joining.
For coming. See you next month. Bye.